So this preparation for giving up everything that we have at a point when we have the greatest gifts, this is autumn. Hello and welcome back to NibblePop. Today in this video we are going to look at the final ode by John Keats to autumn, which will kind of bring this trilogy to an end. The trilogy which consists of 3 odes: Ode to a Nightingale, Ode on a Grecian Urn, and To Autumn. If you have already watched the 2 videos which we have made on Ode to a Nightingale and Ode on a Grecian Urn, then fine. If you haven't watched them, I would strongly advise you to watch them after you finish watching this video. Because taken out of context, To Autumn as a poem is a beautiful one nonetheless. But somehow I feel that once you read To Autumn in connection with the previous 2 odes that I have mentioned, you will realize the full potential of this poem, the real worth of this poem, the way this poem answers Keats's question and quest for immortality. If you have not subscribed to our channel, please do so, because then you can stay connected with us and get notified every time a new video comes up. This is Monami Mukherjee. Welcome once again. We have discussed at length about Keats's life, his achievements, and the tragedy of his early death in the last 2 videos that we have made. Just to give a short recap, Keats, he was born, few years after the French Revolution and a few years after Shelley's birth. He belongs to the 2nd generation of Romantic poets. And strangely, the poets we usually associate with the 2nd generation of Romantic poetry, they died pretty young, and these poets include Shelley, Keats and Byron. In his very short life, Keats managed to write some immortal verses, one of which we will be covering today, To Autumn. As a movement, Romantic poetry is a breaking away from all the previous notions of writing poetry. Romantic poets, they made a lot of changes in the way poets wrote, especially if you consider poetry of the 18th century, the 17th century and even the Renaissance. They focused more on the rural part of England. They focused on things like imagination, how fancy controls the way we perceive the world, and things which were not yet dealt with in English poetry. The treatment of the poetry form was also remarkably new. Earlier we had remarkable writers, especially in drama. We had Shakespeare, and then in epic poetry we had Milton, and even we had a lot of verse satires. We had like Pope and Dryden. But Romantic poetry was mostly about short verses. Yes, sometimes they went on for stanzas, that's true, but they were not epic in structure or size. And at the same time, the subject matter was not man anymore like it was in Renaissance. It was not society as it was in case of neoclassical poetry. It was more about the way in which man is an extension of nature, and the goodness of man being an extension of the goodness of nature. So while these things were true about Wordsworth and Coleridge as well, the 2nd generation of Romantic poets, that is Shelley, Keats, they brought in something more revolutionary, because they had to somehow deviate even from the Wordsworthian way of writing poetry. And the special thing about Keats was his sensuality, the way he uses the 5 senses, and he appeals to these five senses, strangely to go beyond the senses. So I will not baffle you more with any introduction to it. Let's just read the poem, and while reading, I will tell you the exact meaning of, writing on the senses and going beyond it. I'm sure you will catch the beauty of this poem because this is one of the last poems that Keats wrote. He wrote this on September 19, 1819, just a few months before his death. And so far as the context is concerned, he went out for a stroll. It was September, as I told you, and it was early autumn. It was in Winchester. He comes back and then he writes a letter to his friend. I'll just quote a few lines from that letter to set things in perspective, the mood in which he started writing this poem. So the name of his friend was J.H. Reynolds. So he writes this: "How beautiful the season is now." So it was early autumn he was writing on. "How fine the air, a temperate sharpness about it, really, without joking, chaste weather." And then he says, "I never liked stubble fields so much as now, aye, better than the chilly green of spring. Somehow a stubble plain looks warm in the same way that some pictures look warm. This struck me so much in my Sunday's walk that I composed upon it." So this letter was written right after he finished completing this poem. The way he mentions spring in this letter is very interesting. There is a subconscious comparison between autumn and spring. We will see all that here directly in this poem, and I just wanted you to have this letter in your mind. The letter in which Keats categorically says that he prefers autumn to spring. He finds autumn more full of life, more full of warmth than spring. Okay, so let's just go to the poem and start reading straight away. The poem is shorter than Nightingale or Grecian Urn. It has only 3 stanzas, very compact structure, and it begins with a description of autumn. So this is an ode. An ode is a kind of poem where a poet addresses an entity. In case of romantic poetry, it's usually a non-living object or a living object but non-human one, whom the poet not only addresses but also glorifies in a great way. And a link is established between human life or the poet's life and the life and the things which that entity represent. Okay, so that is what we have seen in case of Shelley's Skylark, or here in case of Nightingale or Grecian Urn. And sometimes the poets begin with a direct address, like we see in case of Shelley when he writes about the Skylark and he addresses the Skylark directly, or the West Wind. And in case of Keats also, in Grecian Urn, he addresses the urn directly in the very beginning, while in Nightingale, he begins with a description of his mood. So it depends on, the mood of the poet. So it varies from poem to poem whether the poet will begin by addressing the subject of his ode, or whether he will be describing it or describing something else altogether. Here we see that he does not address autumn directly in the beginning. He gives a description straight away. "Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel, to set budding more and still more later flowers for the bees, until they think warm days will never cease, for summer has overbrimmed their clammy cells." I deliberately went on reading till the end of the stanza because you can't pause when we are reading such beautiful description. Now let's just break these things up into bits and pieces for our understanding. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness. Season of mist means a season where you have a lot of mists in the air. So it's not a clear sky of spring, it's not the cloudy sky of monsoon, but this is a kind of mysterious, misty sky which you see during the early autumn. And at the same time, there is a mellow fruitfulness. Mellow means something which is not very loud. Now you will say, how can a season be loud? Of course, a season can be loud if you hear the thunders during the rainy season, and the storms during the time when the rains come in. That is a very, full of sound and fury kind of season. Autumn does not have a lot of loud noises. It is very mellow, calm, and everywhere you see lots of fruits and ripe vegetables. This is the season when it's a harvest time, and during the harvest time the earth is full of ripe crops. So autumn is the season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun. Now, from the point of view of the poet's geographical location, which is in the northern hemisphere, the sun, it takes a maturing turn. It's going towards the winter solstice, when it's the longest night of the year. And this moment, September, when he is writing this poem, this moment happens to be the autumn equinox moment, when day and night, the duration of day and night, they are equal, and it is just going past that moment. So it is a maturing sun. The sun is getting old, and the duration of sunlight is going to be less and less as winter is approaching. And on the day of the winter solstice, this duration of daylight will be least. Okay, so this sun during the autumn or right after autumn equinox, this sun is a maturing sun. Now, looking at these descriptions, these opening sentences, we find that autumn is not presented as a decaying season in a way. Usually poets present autumn in a different light. If you have read that sonnet by Shakespeare, sonnet number 73, there he says, "That time of year you mayst in me behold." And then he goes on to talk about autumn, the way it represents decay and sorrow, and eventually a harbinger of death. And he equates that sadness with his own situation. Autumn is often seen as a season of sorrowful maturity, yes, but at the same time more about decay and being dried up, being lifeless, as if youth is all that matters to the poets. But what about Keats? How is he describing autumn? He has not yet used any word which represents decay. He's talking about fruitfulness, and he's talking about a conspiracy that is going on between the sun and the earth, as if they are conspiring. They're working together like close friends to do what? To make nature more beautiful, more fruitful in autumn. So he says, close bosom friend of the maturing sun. Autumn is a very close buddy of the sun, and they are conspiring together. How to load and bless. So then he talks about 4 things which autumn plus sun they do. So 4 things which happen during the autumn are because of this friendship between autumn and sunshine. And what are those 4 things? First, load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run. Very beautiful way of describing how the vines which run around the thatch roof of huts, those vines are filled with blossoms. So this is the first thing that is done by the friendship between autumn and sun. The second thing, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, to fill all fruit with ripeness to the core. The apples that are on these cottage trees, they are filled with so much sweetness, to the core, ripeness to the core, that the trees, they almost bend by the weight of the apples, and eventually the apples will drop off. So this is like the primest time of nature, the best time of this apple tree. The way he presents the apples, bending the branches down, that is beautiful. The third thing which this friendship does, to swell the gourd, plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel. Gourd is a large fruit or vegetable, and gourd is filled so much that it swells up. And at the same time, nuts, hazels, they are very small things, but they are also not neglected. Even the nuts are filled completely. So it's all about maturity, and at the same time it's all about fruitfulness. And somehow this whole idea of filling the fruits with sweetness, it is also associated with the idea that these fruits will lead to further plants and further vegetation in the next year, when these plants will come up from these seeds. So autumn is not just a point of fulfillment, it is also a point of promise for a new generation. This is somehow caught in Shelley's West Wind, where he said that the west wind, it buries the seeds, and then eventually those seeds, they turn into new plants during the spring, when thine azure sister and all that. He said that in Ode to the West Wind. Same kind of an idea is brought in here, that these fruits carry in them not just a sweetness for today, but a promise for futurity. This is what autumn does. And the fourth thing which this friendship between autumn and sun, it does, is to set budding more and still more. Look at the repetition, deliberate use of this word more, as if autumn is not satisfied, budding a few flowers here and there. It wants more and more. It's insatiable. Later flowers for the bees, until they think, who is they here? They means the bees. So when there is so much abundance of flowers, the bees get a bit confused. They start to feel that this definitely is summer, because summer means a lot of flowers for the bees, and the bees, they have their cells, their honeycombs already filled with sticky honey, and then they see that there are more flowers coming up, and then they feel that, okay, this means summer is eternal, that winter will never come, then let's just enjoy. So there is a kind of caution here, warning here. He talks about a bit of a reality check that needs to be done with the bees, because the bees are getting confused. They think warm days will never cease. The bees think that it is still summer, for summer has overbrimmed their clammy cells. Clammy means congested. If you ever look at a beehive, you would know it's really something very, full of sticky honey and nectar, and it's a very compact space in which the bees live in. And here, therefore, the word clammy cells, they refer to this beehive. On a different level, if you think this way, bees are acting in a very human way. What do humans do? When human beings are given a lot of things in abundance, when somebody is very rich or somebody is very educated and has a lot of books at his disposal, when somebody has a great life, great health, then they begin to take things for granted. When we have a lot of something, anything, you can have a lot of friends, You can have a lot of followers. You can have a lot of lipsticks in your drawer. Whatever things you have in abundance, you tend to take it for granted. This happens when we talk about affections, when we talk about respect. And whenever we take things for granted, we tend to be a little callous about that or those things. And then when we eventually lose them, because nothing is permanent in this world, not even the lipsticks in your drawer, when we start to lose them, we get so very sorry. Maybe Keats is giving a hint at this humane side of the bees. The bees are thinking that the summer days will never end. We will never run out of nectar. But they don't know that yes, autumn might give you a show of abundance, but it does not guarantee any continuity. So this whole idea of autumn that is formed in the first stanza, it gives a complete picture. There is abundance, but abundance blended with a certain finality, a certain assurance of decay, decline. This is going to end. Second stanza. Now we have a direct address. Now the poet is addressing autumn. And when he is addressing a season, of course, he is considering the season as a person who can hear him. And what do we call the figure of speech where a non-human entity is considered as a person? Yes, you are right. It's called a personification. So autumn is personified in the first extract also, in the first stanza also, because it is a close bosom friend of the maturing sun. So both sun and autumn are personified here, and here we have a more detailed idea about what kind of person autumn is. The question that Keats asks and the answer he gives himself, they're again very remarkable. Who hath not seen thee oft amid thy store? Sometimes whoever seeks abroad may find thee sitting careless on a granary floor, thy hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind, or on a half-reaped furrow sound asleep, drowsed with the fume of poppies, while thy hook spares the next swath and all its twined flowers. And sometimes, like a gleaner, thou dost keep steady thy leaden head across a brook, or by a cider press, with patient look, thou watchest the last oozings, hours by hours. Look at the laziness of the images. It's as if Keats has all the time in the world to write this poem. Ironically, he didn't have much time. He was to die soon, and he knew that. So how does he look at laziness? How does he look at idle way of, just spending time doing nothing, the way this autumn figure is represented? And at the same time, autumn does some real hard work, because in the first stanza we have seen the things that autumn do. But if you look at autumn as a person, you will never see that kind of frenzied activity that you associate with spring. Imagine spring to be a human. How would it be? It'll come like, oh God, it was winter. I have to work now. I have to dig those graves and put those seeds up alive so that they start breathing. Okay, I'll have to do this. I'll have to do that. That's the activity of spring. Summer is furiously active. Rainy season is definitely active. Autumn reaps the benefit of the whole year. It's time to pick your harvest, to see what you have achieved. It's not the time to work towards more achievement. It's a time to realize the worth of this year's work. And now we will focus on the images that are created to create this personality in front of us. Who hath not seen thee oft amid thy store? And then later he uses the word granary floor. Store, granary floor, they all refer to these places where crops are stored after they are harvested. So obviously this autumn figure, it stays very close around these storehouses of grains. I somehow have this subconscious link with this figure of Lakshmi. Now that's because I'm from Bengal, and in my Bengali Hindu consciousness we associate autumn with the season of harvest, which we call Nabanno, and then it is the time when people of Bengal they welcome the new rice and the Lakshmi. Throughout India, Lakshmi is worshipped in and around the time of September, October, and the figure of Lakshmi with her barn owl and the concept of this goddess of benevolence, goddess of rich crop. This whole idea is very similar to the way the figure of autumn is created by Keats. This is also uncanny because just like I told you during our video lecture on Kubla Khan, that was long back, like almost 1.5 years back. In Kubla Khan, I found a similar kind of a connection between the figure of Saraswati and damsel with a dulcimer. So this is not very unnatural. These romantic poets, they were aware of the different traditions of the Orient, especially now that India was a very a trending thing in their minds. Remember, this is also the time when England was gaining ground as a colonial emperor of India. So these cross-cultural connections do come up, and there is nothing wrong if you mention them even. This is your personal way of looking at it. And I'm sure rituals of harvesting, this is done during the month of November, October, late September, across nations, across cultures. I'm not aware of any particular harvest ritual of Africa because that is not my ethnic origin. But I'm sure that they also have their own version of harvest ritual, just like we all have our versions of the spring festival. Anthropologists will be able to talk about these linkages in a better way. Let's just move on. So autumn is presented as a figure of abundance, as a woman figure who is not very physically active, and at the same time who takes care of a lot of things. She's taking care of the store, the granary, and her hair is soft lifted by the winnowing wind. The deliberate use of alliteration and the soft vowel sounds, they are almost matching to create that mysterious air about the autumnal figure who is drowsy. And why is she drowsy? Because there are poppy fields around her, and poppy, which is also used to produce opium, a narcotic, and at the same time it creates a kind of drowsy fume if you are around a poppy field. Or on a half-reaped furrow. Furrow is the channel that is created by the plough in which seeds would be planted. It is a half-reaped furrow, which means it is only half harvested. So look at the way in which laziness is presented to us. It's not yet completely harvested. Autumn is sitting there in that furrow, and she has no rush. She doesn't feel the need to rush about things, to complete the harvesting. Drowsed with the fume of poppies, while thy hook spares the next swath and all its twine flowers. So somehow she's collecting poppies or the seeds, and she misses one branch. Doesn't really matter to her because she doesn't have that frenzy in her. She has drowsiness. Now we are gradually going towards inactivity. So while in the first stanza we have some activity, doing this, doing that, filling this fruit, some activity was seen. Now it is getting more and more in a drowsy way. It's graduating to a state of inaction. And this is a very gradual movement through the lines. And what is the last image we have? Cider press is a place where overripe apples, they are used to choose cider. Apples which are not perfect because they are more ripe than perfect. So there is a beginning of a rotting process. Cider is used as an ingredient for alcohol, for making wine, yes, but at the same time there's an element of decay when you use the word cider. It is not apple juice, it is cider. So it is 1 degree more ripe than what it should be. And what is Autumn doing? There's a cider press, the apples are being pressed there, and she's sitting there and watching. The drops are falling, hours are being spent in this inaction. Usually, we celebrate action, we celebrate change. Here, we do not see much change. We see a kind of stagnancy. Because when something is completely perfectly ripe, any further change means decay. Because it's never a simple straight line up. It's always a point where you reach the top and then you only can come down. Autumn is that height, that point of the, you can say, zenith. It's the topmost point of ripeness that a season can achieve. And then, if you are not lazy, then you're going to change and then you're going to turn into winter. So this laziness is like a defense mechanism for autumn. It wants time to freeze, but time won't freeze. It can only freeze on a Grecian urn, and then it won't be life. So what does autumn do? Does autumn become a Grecian urn? Does autumn freeze itself or herself? Autumn is lazy, but autumn is not a Grecian urn. She knows that she has to change because ripeness is something which must be achieved, and the cost that she has to pay is the eventual decay of that ripeness. And this happens in the third stanza, where the poet is conscious that people celebrate spring. They talk about the songs of spring. Shelley literally wrote about, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? As if the whole point of winter was to bring in spring. As if winter is all about that waiting for spring. It doesn't have a purpose of its own. Here, Keats is saying that no, every season has a purpose. And he says, where are the songs of spring? So this is another question we have. So first, in the second stanza, he asks a question. And then in the third, he is asking another question. Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? Think not of them. Thou hast thy music too. While barred clouds bloom the soft dying day and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue, then in a wailful choir the small gnats mourn among the river's shallows, borne aloft or sinking as the light wind lives or dies, and full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly bourne. Hedge crickets sing, and now with treble soft the red-breast whistles from a garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies. Another list. List of what? List of the ways in which you can hear autumn, the music of autumn. First he asks, where are the songs of spring? And then he says, I don't need them. I have lovely music even in September. And then he tries to concentrate on the sound of autumn. As I was telling you that Keats is a very sensual poet, and he pays a lot of attention to the sensation of sound. In Ode to a Nightingale, he is directly listening to a sound and talking about it. In Grecian urn, he is so imaginative that he can't hear the piper who is making music. But he can imagine it so well that he says that this is even better. The heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. So in Nightingale, he has a real music going on which he writes. In Grecian Urn, he sees a visual representation of music and he writes on that. In Autumn, he has nothing. So see how he is going beyond his senses. He doesn't even need those visual triggers to talk about music. He can imagine and he can actually sense the different kinds of sounds and calls them music. And he is not just talking about the sound of the bird's song. He is talking about some bird songs here and music made by birds, but he's talking of nature in general. And what are the sounds he mentions? This is very important if you are going to attempt any reference to context question. Usually you're given this line, thou hast thy music too, and then you're supposed to write all the kinds of music that Keats lists here. So first you have to give the list. Let's just look at the list here. What are the kinds of sounds we have here? Small gnats, they moan among the river shallows. So they are small little insects. And when these gnats, they are floating in the wind, they are flying in the wind rises or falls, and accordingly that sound rises and falls. Because these insects, they are very light winged, so the wind controls their movement. They are not like birds which can fly against the wind even. So here we have a kind of extension of that winnowing wind which we had in the second stanza. The winnowing wind soft lifting the hair of autumn. That same wind is now lifting the insects up and down, and with that their chirping is going up and down. So that is first sound we have. And full grown lambs, loud bleat from hilly bourne. The lambs, they are now mature. They are going to give birth, and maybe some of them have already given birth. So they have achieved motherhood, they have become parents now, and they are celebrating the completion of this fertile cycle of life. They are not little lambs who are lost in the way. They are lambs who know about life and who have lived it. And what other sounds we have? Hedge crickets sing. Hedge crickets, kind of grasshopper type of insects. So unusual references are made here. Real sounds of forests and woods and isolated places. This is rural England painted in front of your eyes. Hedge crickets, and now with treble soft, so a low yet a full of treble voice. Treble is something which has a high pitch, but here it is treble soft. Usually treble is not soft, treble is shrill. Like Shelley said, shrill delight, skylark, that is treble. He is talking about treble soft. So a contradiction. Treble soft voice of who? Redbreast. Now robin redbreast is usually a winter bird and its arrival means the winter is almost here. So in the first stanza, we might see early autumn, but by the time we reach the third stanza, we can as well see the arrival of winter here. So maybe it was written on September 19th, but it doesn't stop there, it flows on, because Keats knows that he cannot freeze autumn even in a poem. When he has 3 stanzas on autumn, the third stanza is bound to be temporally in a future mode than the first stanza. So time flows. Just like time flows in real life through autumn, in this poem, time flows. It's not like urn, frozen, no. And we see the redbreast whistling from a garden croft. So it's like ushering in winter. And finally, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies. You might wonder, What kind of an abrupt ending is this? What is this poem all about? He is ending with just a random reference to swallows, which are just another set of birds which flock together. Why is this line so important? Because what we know, the last line of poems are important. In sonnets, we have the concluding couplet, the grand ending. Gatherings, swallows, how come this be the grand ending? And everybody says Ode to Autumn is one of the greatest odes. I want you to think about the last line again. What does it actually talk about? Gathering swallows, which means swallows are birds which are gathering in the skies, twittering in the skies. But this is not just about that. Why are they doing that? Because they are starting to go on their great migration across the world. These swallows are gathering because this is going to be the beginning of this long journey when they are going to leave this place. So the last line is not about just gathering of birds, it's about the birds leaving. So it's an image not of gathering, it's an image of desertion, going away, leaving something. So this preparation for giving up everything that we have at a point when we have the greatest gifts, this is autumn. So autumn is not just a season which acts as the link between monsoon and winter. No, it is a season which has the greatest of purpose. The purpose not of reaching just the height of ripeness, but the season which knows how to let it go gracefully. So somehow it becomes a greater teacher to us than the Grecian urn, because it doesn't instruct. In Shelley's odes, what do we see? What does he do? He asks the skylark to teach him half the madness. He asks the west wind to help him become the prophet. Even in Grecian urn, what does Keats want? He wants the Grecian urn to tell him what's the point of beauty. In autumn, he doesn't need to ask that question. Autumn answers by becoming that flow of time through his poem, which autumn is in real life. So in simple terms, this poem is about the abundance of nature, which teaches us that this must go away because this will come back. So it's about a lesson in the cycle of life which will help you not to hold on to something, not to give so much importance to something that you lose sight of the real purpose of life. And what is real purpose of life? It's not to become immortal. Keats has been obsessed with the idea of immortality, how to achieve immortality. Looking at autumn, he realizes that he likes the stubble plains, which are not like those colorful spring valleys. He likes the stubble plains and the rosy hue, beautiful image, because this gives him a kind of feeling that it's okay to have a short life, provided you know how to fill it up with whatever you can. Immortality is not the object of living. Ripeness is all. This is a quote from King Lear. So the music of spring is not something you should mourn for, you should be sorry about. You should enjoy your own music. This is what autumn teaches him, or he tells autumn, as if autumn is complaining. The three stanzas, they act like snapshots, and you can see the progress of time through them. So this is the final impression of the poem. Is there are a lot of sensual images, things which appeal not just to your sense of hearing, but also to the sense of taste, to the sense of sight. And somehow all these senses are transcended. You reach a higher truth than just your sensations. So Keats is using sensations to go beyond them. He is using the sights, the sound, the smell, the touch, the taste of autumn to reach a, you can say, super sensory field of idea where he is telling that autumn has its own music, and that music is the music of fulfillment, of ripeness, of richness, and at the same time of somehow desertion, desolation, and going away. So this poem is about the music of autumn, and this poem is about how that music is interpreted by Keats, who was feeling that he has arrived at his autumn when he should have been in his spring. So there are so many metaphors that he makes use of, and so many images that keep floating in front of our eyes. You are something around 20, 21, 22 years old now. You will have a different idea about this poem. I had a different idea about this poem when I was in my college studying English honors. Now I have a different idea about the poem. This poem changes meaning as you grow. This is the speciality about Keats. He at 25 knew how I might feel at 40, how I might feel at 60, because he knew how to listen to the instructions, to the philosophical advice of nature. That was the sign of a true romantic. If you have felt any different about this poem, why don't you write that down in the comment section? We have tried to give you as much annotation possible. And if you still have any problems, you can always ask them in the comment section. Thank you all for being with us. I hope you have enjoyed today's class. Let me just give you a little bit of a hint. Maybe we'll take up some other romantic poet, not necessarily somebody who wrote after Keats. Keep guessing in the comment section. I'll see you all in the next video. Stay happy, stay subscribed till then. This is Monami Mukherjee signing off. Bye-bye.